So I am talking today about my book, Prove It. And I wrote this book, and I wanted to achieve a couple of goals in writing it. Firstly, it was during the reign of Trump 1.0 that I got the idea for the book, and I was alarmed by the disinformation, misinformation, the era, the post-truth era. And I thought, well, maybe if I showcase how the scientific method works and if I tell good enough stories and people read the book, well, just by osmosis, they'll get a sense of how evidence testing works. Because after all, the scientific method is the best exemplar we have for acquiring knowledge. Something I didn't realize myself till I was writing this book is that scientia actually comes from the Greek root for knowledge, which is why those of us who are scientists here became scientists in the first place, that thirst for knowledge. Am I right, Davo?
Excellent.
Right. Am I right, Martin Harris, who is like the most knowledge-thirsty person I know? You can ask Martin anything. Ask him about snails or whatever. Anyway. So, and the other reason for writing the book is I just wanted to give rein to my wanderlust, and I had some major questions like, I'll show you in a moment the area of science I worked in, but I wondered, is science the same across the different sciences and across the centuries? So before I started writing the book, I'd been the editor of this science magazine, Cosmos, for 6 years, and it was a wonderful challenge because my own field had been that of looking at how the fruit fly lays down its body plan. And the fruit fly, like every embryo, starts off as a ball of mush. And, Aristotle realized this problem. He'd crack open a chicken egg and look for any sort of information on it on the day that it was laid. And there's nothing there. As any of you who've cracked open a chicken egg know, there's, maybe you'll find a little bit of blood if it's started to fertilize, but if it's truly just been laid, there is no information there that we can see, no little baby chicken that you just add on to. And what we found when I was at the University of California is we identified the so-called pattern-forming genes, which give that information to that, sack of cells and start laying down this pattern in a series of stripes. And then the other cells can follow that information to start laying down the segments. But I've jumped ahead of myself. Now, scientific method that I want to talk about. This is not Aristotle's science, as good as he was at observing chicken eggs. Just to recap, when we think of the great Greek philosophers, we start with Socrates in the middle, and Socrates' student was Plato, and then Plato's student was Aristotle. And Aristotle's, if you Google, you'll often find that, Aristotle is the father of science, yes, but that's not the sort of science we're talking about. We're talking, let me give you an example of Aristotle's science. He's a great observer, but not so much of an empirical tester. So, for instance, he had this theory that men have more teeth than women. Now, all he had to do was count the teeth of his 2 wives and his daughter, but he never did. So what we're talking about is, here's the poster boy, the science of the scientific revolution. And the reason Newton is the poster boy for the scientific revolution is because he puts evidence in the driver's seat. So, for instance, he comes up with his theory of gravity, but then he says, but actually, all I can do really is describe how it works, the maths that describes it. And to tell you the truth, I can't really give you a theory of what gravity is. He's going to leave that to Einstein few hundred years later. So that's the sort of science we're talking about with the scientific revolution. And, one of my questions in this book was, has the scientific method changed over time? Is it the same method that Einstein used coming up with his theory of general relativity? Is it the same method that Kip Thorne used when he proved the existence of gravitational waves by, with his fantastic calculations and using LIGO, that magnificent instrument, to detect the existence of gravitational waves? Is it the same sort of science, indeed, that artificial intelligence is doing? As we know, AIs are doing science. And I would say, yes, they are all doing the same sort of science. And the other big question I had was about the philosophy of science. I love this quote of Richard Feynman. That was certainly my experience as a working scientist. I never encountered the philosophy of science as a working scientist. It seemed to be about as useful as ornithology is to birds. But I have to say that I did discover the philosophy of science in my journey through the different areas, as I'll talk to you about today. And, for those of you who are scientists, well, we do it because we have a love of knowledge, but scientia potentia est, knowledge is power, and we're certainly seeing the abuse of that power in the current moment. Just a little anecdote here. After I'd written my book, I meant to hold it up and show you a picture, but it claims to be a guide to the post-truth era. Thank you, Alan. Just throw it over. And here's a little anecdote. So one thing I really worried about is that, oh my God, what will I say if I'm doing a radio interview, as you do? And, I get asked, okay, so what's your guide to the post-truth era? You've typically got a 2-minute soundbite or a 1-minute soundbite. I mean, there's a whole book here of examples of a guide for the post-truth era. But I did eventually, after a bad experience with a drive time radio host who said, well, what is your guide? I mean, we've got all these conflicting scientists, all these scientists who give us conflicting information. How are we supposed to make sense of that? Anyway, I found my 1-minute soundbite, and it came from 1662, and it was the motto of the British Royal Society that already come up with their 1-minute soundbite. Nullius in verba, that is the motto of the Royal Society. And what it means is take nobody's word for it, which happens to be the title of my book. And that is really the scientific method in action. Scientists do disagree, and that is not a disparagement of science. That is the power of the scientific method. So, unfortunately, we really are seeing a real perversion in the understanding of scientific method at the moment in the United States. It is really, we are witnessing the Lysenkoization of science. As a journalist, us science journalists have often used the example of Lysenko as a cautionary tale. Lysenko was did not believe in genetics. He believed it wasn't about the good breeding and getting good genes into agricultural plants. He believed it was all about good rearing, and that really appealed to Stalin. And as a result of Lysenko becoming the dominant force in Russian agriculture, millions of people starved. And that is, even though I've used Lysenko as a cautionary tale for years, it is unbelievable to me what is happening in the United States at the moment. So this incredible perversion of science. I mean, the Trump administration, RFK Jr., will talk about we're doing gold standard science, which includes things like RFK Jr. completely disrupting the childhood vaccination schedule, even as measles and whooping cough are soaring. It involves him claiming that autism is linked to childhood vaccines, something which has been roundly tested and found to have no evidence behind it, or claiming that Tylenol is linked, use by pregnant women is linked to autism. Again, something that has a very poor evidence base to it and has since been, high-ranking journals have shown that there really is not substantive evidence behind that. There's been the defunding of the Nobel Prize-winning mRNA vaccine technology. The same, even if it has nothing to do with vaccines, but very promising vaccines against cancer. We've seen the Energy Department last year deny that climate change is real or as serious as people claim. And then this February, the EPA, the Environment Protection Authority, repealing the endangerment finding, which means the EPA can no longer regulate emissions. The endangerment finding of 2009 found that greenhouse gases and rising greenhouse gases are a danger to public health. So the good news in just the last couple of days is that a federal judge has struck down Kennedy's vaccine policies. The judge says that the vaccine committee historically made decisions through careful review of scientific evidence. Unfortunately, the government has disregarded those methods and thereby undermined the integrity of its actions. And then just yesterday, we now know that NIH funds will flow again, but there's nothing really to celebrate because 10,000 scientists have lost their jobs, 7,800 grants have been terminated across infectious disease, pandemic preparedness, climate change, misinformation, and studies on gender and minorities. So, this is just a snapshot from last September of Marty Makary, the FDA commissioner, standing in the White House and claiming there is a causal relationship between prenatal Tylenol or Panadol, acetaminophen, it's the same thing as the chemical name, use and neurodevelopmental disorders of ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, for which there is an extremely poor evidence base. And since then, several high-ranking journals have come out disputing that. Bottom line, when you mix politics and science, you get politics. So let me move on to tell you about my book. I've got 5 chapters there that cover 5 areas of science: gravitational waves as a recent proof of general relativity, COVID origins, human origins, the science of medicine, and human consciousness. But today, I'm going to take you through 2 chapters. One of them is on COVID origins, and the other is on consciousness. So, as I said, even though I never encountered the philosophy of science in my working life as a scientist, it did pop out of this chapter on COVID origins in the form of Karl Popper and his idea of falsification that, going back to David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher of the 18th century, pointed out that you really cannot prove anything in science because, you do an experiment and it shows that, okay, you get this result today, but how can you be sure that you will get that result tomorrow? Even if you do it 1,000 times, 10,000 times, it is not a law of nature that the result you get today will be the result you get tomorrow. Of course, that's the way we all do our science, and we rely on statistics to, believe in it. But, philosophically speaking, David Hume is right. And Karl Popper decided, okay, how am I going to solve David Hume's problem? And he says, well, science still has a leg to stand on. Even if we can't prove things, we can disprove things. We can falsify theories. And this idea of falsification comes up in the origins of COVID. So with the origins of COVID, there have been two theories in play. One of them is that the COVID, SARS-CoV-2 emerged at the Huanan seafood market, right up there in the top left of this graph, which is where the first cases came from, the very first case in December 2019, and most of the first 40 cases, 2/3 of them, were traced to that market. The other theory is that it began at the Wuhan Institute of Virology across the Yangtze River, either at that campus or another one a few kilometers further south. So let me take you through the two theories. So most of the basis for believing it came from the lab is speculative. We know the lab housed 2,000 bat coronaviruses. One of the main functions for this lab, and the reason it was created, was because the first SARS in 2002 was traced to a bat coronavirus. So they were charged with monitoring those bat coronaviruses to see, is anything nasty brewing in bat coronaviruses? So they did house 2,000 bat coronaviruses. They did experiments to test the functions of those viruses. Could they infect human cells? Were they developing capabilities to make them more virulent? The new form of SARS, SARS-CoV-2, actually carried a new site that wasn't present on the original SARS, called a furin cleavage site. And people had been wondering, could this so-called furin cleavage site, make a SARS virus even more infective? So, gosh, maybe somebody had engineered it in. And the other thing is that we knew that the first SARS had leaked twice from labs in China. And there certainly were these kinds of experiments on the radar, so-called gain of function, which had made certain scientists very alarmed. So lots of speculative evidence or speculative reasons to really suspect it could have come from a lab, and it certainly needed to be tested. What's the evidence for the market? Well, it's not speculative, it's very material evidence. For one thing, we know that the first SARS outbreak in 2002 did start in a wildlife market. The source was traced to civets, and that was in the Shenzhen wildlife market. We know that the first case did come from a wildlife market for SARS. Sorry, this is not right. SARS-CoV-2, it should read, not SARS-CoV-1. Was a seafood vendor from the wildlife market. As I said before, the first 41 cases, 2/3 were traced to the market. And in addition, we were not able to do what we were in the first SARS outbreak of 2002, which is to go in there and find the animals, because they shut down the market on January the 1st, and all the wild animals that were on sale there disappeared. So in theory, it wasn't possible to go in there and test the wild animals. However, subsequently it emerged that when they'd taken swabs from the market, some of those swabs contained DNA of civets and raccoon dogs, and in the same swab, the virus SARS-CoV-2. Furthermore, further evidence is that in the early days of SARS-CoV-2, there were two circulating strains, but people either had one strain or the other. People didn't carry both. And what those swabs from the market showed is that some of the swabs carried one strain or the other. So all that is consistent with the virus having been present at the market. It's not consistent with another theory that says, well, somebody from the Wuhan Institute of Virology came and spread the virus. They were a super spreader and they spread the virus at the market. If that had been the case, you would have gotten a single strain present at the market. So as I say, now we know that there was the DNA of raccoon dogs that are highly susceptible to SARS-CoV-2, and they shed the virus and they were sold at the market. So moving on, in 2021, the WHO had sent a team to Wuhan, and they reported back saying the market origin is likely to very likely, the lab origin is extremely unlikely. And a few scientists were unhappy with that. Like, for instance, Michael Warraby, who's an evolutionary biologist at the University of Arizona, and very much a believer in Karl Popper's philosophy. A scientist's job is to kick the tires of a hypothesis to try and falsify it. So he wasn't convinced that the WHO had done a good enough job investigating the labs. So he wrote a letter to Science with several colleagues saying, we really need to come up with another way of investigating the origins of COVID-19. And this is the method he came up with. He was locked down at the time, as were many scientists in the US. So he goes into his basement and he thinks, well, how can I falsify the market origin theory? So he starts looking through all the news reports from China. He uses a language translator, and he manages to find data on not the first 40 cases, but the first 168 cases. And he finds that 2/3 of the cases were not linked to the market. So he thinks, well, how can I get more information on these cases? Well, he finds their addresses. And what he's doing is he's going back to the origins of epidemiology, to John Snow, who's the father of epidemiology. And in 1854, he wants to trace the origins of a cholera outbreak in London. So what does he do? He looks at the first cases and where did they live? And they all lived clustered around the Broad Street water pump. And what does he do? He discovers that the origin of cholera in that epidemic was that water pump. So Michael Warraby does a similar sort of analysis. Where did those first 168 cases live? Now you have to realize that Wuhan is a city of 12 million people packed into an area the same size as Melbourne, a very dense city with dozens of, mega shopping malls and other centres where, crowds of people congregate. So where did the first 168 cases live? maybe we're going to discover that they're all clustered around where somebody from the Wuhan Institute of Virology lived. Maybe we'll discover they're clustered around one of the laboratories. We don't. He comes up with this extraordinary finding. There's the Huanan seafood market, and all those early cases are clustered around the seafood market. And the highest density of cases is, in that tiny radius, just a few hundred meters away from the market or less. To me, that is the strongest evidence you can get of the origins of COVID-19. Okay, I'll leave that there. I've shown you that Karl Popper was involved in looking for the origins of COVID, and it certainly, I think the preponderance of evidence is overwhelmingly in favour of a market origin. Moving on to consciousness now. Why have I decided to include consciousness in this book, even though my husband, Ella Finkel, tried very hard to stop me? You can ask him why later. But I have to admit that unlike a lot of people I know who are absolutely fascinated by consciousness, I'm not all that fascinated by consciousness. I can't explain why. I'm just not. But what fascinated me is that this is a case study, a snapshot. We can watch this field moving out of philosophy into science. Philosophy, I have a lot of respect for philosophers, but it is not science. In philosophy, anything goes. You can have theories like panpsychism, which in my view is pretty absurd, and it claims that consciousness is not to do necessarily with our brain, that it's out there in the universe and that there are atoms of consciousness distributed through the universe. If you're looking confused, good. And our brain, whatever, I don't know, it's an absurd theory, but it's allowed by philosophy. So we're seeing this field moving to science, which is rule bound, nullius in verba. You have to be able to test your theory. So and this takes us, every one of my chapters had a patron saint of philosophy, and for this chapter, the patron saints were the opponents of Popper, like Imre Lakatos, who, together with Popper, was in his department at the London School of Economics, as it happens. And unlike Popper, he said, actually, in reality, scientists are not like Michael Warraby. They do not spend their lives trying to disprove their own theories. Quite the opposite. They'll do anything to save their own babies. And, they have thick skins, and even in the face of contradictory data, they will invent a rescue hypothesis. And Thomas Kuhn, who maybe is a more familiar name, who, came up with the term paradigm shift, and in his 1960s book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and he says, actually scientists are stuck in their paradigms until there's a paradigm shift. So they are the patron saints of this chapter. And so how does the science of consciousness start getting out of philosophy? Well, it begins with Francis Crick. So who from, the double helix, coming up with the structure of the double helix, base pairing, the code. So he cracks the mystery of life in 1953, and then he decides, okay, that's done. He does a bit more with, decoding codons and things like that. And then he decides, now I'm going to move on to the other big mystery of life, which is consciousness. And so let's see, in the 1970s, he moves from Cambridge to the Salk Institute, and by the 1980s, he's well and truly getting into thinking more about the neuroscience of consciousness, and he meets up with a new young sidekick. You know, when he cracked the code, the structure of DNA, it was James Watson. Now his new sidekick is Christoph Koch, 40 years his junior. And here's the young Christoph Koch. I'll show you another picture of him later. And he's a computational neuroscientist at Caltech. And in 1990, the two of them publish a paper called Towards a Neurobiological Theory of Consciousness. And it's like a manifesto of the field. This is now how we're going to take consciousness, drag it out of philosophy, and underpin it with science. It was good timing. What's happening in 1990? It also happens to be the year that functional MRI is invented. And fMRI allows you to peer in at an active brain. So it's like a movie camera for the mind. And, you know, you can observe the activity, the neural impulses. You know, the proxy for that is blood flow, but neural activity of a person while they're thinking or feeling or whatever they're doing. And you've got this movie camera for the mind. And the other reason it was good timing is that psychology by then had really given us lots of great tricks for separating, distinguishing visual signals from conscious perception. So here's a very familiar example of that. Hopefully you can get this to work for you. But have a look at that vase. Or is it a vase or is it two silhouettes? Who can see a vase? Hands up. Who sees two silhouettes? You see both? Not at the same time, though. Really? You're not supposed to be able to see both at the same time. All right. You need to check in for an MRI. In theory, at the same time. Okay. Most people, it flickers. You see one and then you see the other. It's not. And yet the visual information, it's hitting your retina, it's going to the visual center at the back of your brain, hasn't changed. What is changing is what you're conscious of. So there's lots of tricks like that that allow this separation of conscious visual perception from just what, the visual information is that's going in. And another wonderful example is the Harvard gorilla experiment, which you may or may not have seen, but it goes back, I think, now to the 80s. And what you have is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 frames of a movie here. I'm sorry, it's not very good, but it's a movie. And if you're watching this movie, you're being asked to count the number of ball tosses to people who are wearing white T-shirts. So they're playing basketball, white T-shirts versus black T-shirts. Your job is just to count the throws between the white T-shirts. But in the middle, a guy in a gorilla suit walks onto the screen. Now, you've been told to watch this video and then you're asked, did you see how many ball tosses between the white T-shirts did you see? And people will answer. And half of them will say they didn't see anything unusual. Half of them don't see the gorilla. So all of this is to say there is a difference between the visual information coming in and your conscious perception. So it's a trick, a hack, so that you can now get in there and design experiments to try to see what is happening when you're aware of the gorilla, when you have the conscious perception of gorilla, as opposed to not having the conscious perception of a gorilla. It'll all be the same in the visual circuits, but what is changing somewhere else? So that's a very rough idea of what happens. Sorry, I'll go back. And it gets much, much more detailed, and this isn't the place to go into it. If you want the detail, read my book. Okay, I do want to say that in their 1990 manifesto, Francis Crick and Christoph Koch omitted one important thing. They did not try to define consciousness. And you would think if you're going to put something, you subject something to a scientific investigation, first thing you need to do is give it a precise definition. Well, they say, we feel it's better to avoid a precise definition because of the dangers of premature definition. It's either going to be misleading or overly restrictive or both. And, there are precedents. So in the scientific study of heat, at the beginning in the 17th century, they did not have a good definition of heat. Was it something like a fluid that flowed from one body to another? Or was it a property of molecules moving, atoms and molecules moving? Yes, it is a property of the latter. But they could not come up with a definition, but they could start trying to measure it. And by that means, they could move on. And so Koch and Crick and Koch, say, well, let's do something similar. We can't define it, but let's try and measure something. We've got this wonderful movie camera now for the mind. We can observe different states of consciousness. Let's measure some sort of brain correlate of what is changing during different conscious states, the neural correlates of consciousness. And in their 1990 paper, they actually come up with this theory that says, maybe what's happening is that when something goes to conscious perception, it has to do with neurons, humming in synchrony, coherent semi-synchronous oscillations. Try to remember that. 30 years on from that, we still have no definition of consciousness. The philosopher Thomas Metzinger says, oh gosh, it's this ill-defined folk psychological umbrella term. At a conference a couple of years ago, a neurologist said, we have 700 definitions just in this room. The definitions that float around are all very fuzzy. It's the experience of being you, or maybe, the experience of being a bat. We can never truly understand what it's like to be a bat. And by the same token, will AI become conscious? If it does, we will never understand it because, like a bat, we will never understand what it's like to be a bat. We will never understand what it's like to be an AI. This is what a friend of mine, Adil Razi, a computational neuroscientist at Monash, said to me yesterday. Even if machines become conscious, it'll be nothing like our consciousness. So we don't have a good definition of consciousness, nor do we have any overarching theory of consciousness. The field is pre-paradigmatic, like the way, we thought about life prior to the 1950s. Anything was up for grabs, maybe quantum vibrations in a crystal, pre-paradigmatic. There's no overarching theory. There are 20 theories, and they're all in their own little silos, people trapped in their own paradigms. So the reason I was attracted to writing this chapter is that to get out of these silos, there was a bold proposition of an adversarial collaboration. Let's get these scientists who are all, working on consciousness, all working in their own silos. Let's subject them to an adversarial collaboration, because the problem is that they work away in their silos, and when they design an experiment, they design that experiment not to disprove their theory, but to prove their theory. And that's why for 30 years, since Crick and Koch came up with their idea of how to test consciousness, yes, we've got lots of data. Yes, we've got lots of theories, and none of these theories are being culled. They're all just sort of going along in their own silos. We're not advancing the field. So the idea was, let's get these theorists two at a time. Let's put them in the gladiatorial arena. Let the theorists design an experiment together instead of being in their own silos. They'll get together, they'll design an experiment that will test both of their theories, and ideally only one contestant will be left standing. So the adversarial collaboration, it was actually the brainchild of Christoph Koch. 30 years on, he was getting a little dismayed that there was a lack of progress in his field, lots of data, lots of theories, but not really moving on to establish an overarching paradigm for the field. And he is approached by the Templeton Foundation, which likes to look at crossover areas of science and philosophy. And he persuades them to fund these adversarial collaborations to the tune of $20 million. And the idea is that you will have the two contestants, the two gladiators at the bottom. So they are each the leading theorists of two leading theories. The one on the left is Giulio Tononi. He's the architect of the integrated information theory. Stan Deheen, he's the architect of the global neuronal workspace theory. And at the top, we have three referees. These are all researchers in the area of consciousness, but they're neutral. They don't have allegiance to any field, and they've actually distinguished themselves already by trying to design experiments like Popperian scientists to disprove theories. So they all get together, the whole five of them and others, and they collaborate to design an experiment, actually two experiments, which will try to, weigh in between the two theories, ideally knock one of them out of the arena, and they all agree to it in good faith. Let me try and explain to you these two theories. Let me start with the global neuronal workspace theory. It's quite a delightful theory. And it builds on a delightful metaphor of the theatre of the mind. This actually, a French philosopher, Hippolyte Taine, in the 17th or 18th century, came up with this metaphor, this idea that consciousness is like a theatre, and there's lots of stuff going on, lots, you're all sitting here, lots and lots of inputs, but at any one moment, what are you conscious of? You're conscious, hopefully, of me and, this talk, even though there's lots of other stuff going on. And so the idea is that the mind is like this theatre, lots and lots of inputs going in, stuff happening backstage, all over the place, sensory information, and so on. But at any one moment, the spotlight is on one one thing. That's what you're conscious of in this moment. And it's kind of a limited workspace. It's hard to be conscious of two things at one time. And that's the conscious workspace. And then you broadcast what you're conscious of to the other parts of your working mind. Maybe you need to make a decision based on what you're conscious of in this moment. Are you going to buy my book or not? You need to decide whether you're going to commit something to memory. So basically, that's the idea. It has a long history, as I say, going back to this philosopher, and then gets picked up in the 1960s by the psychologist Bernie Bars, maybe 70s or 80s. And he's also influenced by the AI of that time, which, unlike most computing, which is parallel, the AIs of that time were experimenting with bringing programs into a common area where they could interact the workspace. So Bernie Bars elaborates on it. And then in the modern era, Stan Deheen, Stan Deheen from the Collège de France, he starts really putting some mathematical modeling behind it. And he's really the current architect of modern global neuronal workspace theory. The other theory is integrated information theory. It's really hard to explain. It's really hard to understand. I'm not the only one who has trouble with it. Even this lady, Lucia Maloney, who's a neuroscientist specializing in consciousness, told me, even though she's heard it explained to her dozens of times, she doesn't really understand it. So I'm not alone in being at a loss to understand it. But basically, it says that consciousness emerges from integrated information. And when you have highly integrated information, you have a high phi, which is the conscious state. And when you have low phi, it's an unconscious state. The best I can do with a metaphor for integrated information theory comes from Anil Seth, who's a wonderful consciousness researcher. If you want to know more about consciousness, I highly recommend reading his books. And he too has had a lot of trouble understanding integrated information theory. And he has this, speaking to some of these researchers, they talk about it is a maximally irreducible cause-effect structure. I hope that's clear to you. Or the acronym AMICES. Right. But thank you, Anil Seth. His metaphor is, well, maybe it's something like flocking birds. There's information in that flock at any one moment. Look at this beautiful, structure they've formed. It can't be reduced. And it's different in every moment. So somehow that works for me. The consciousness structure that I had a second ago is different to the one I'm going to have in the next second. It's kind of like flocking birds. It's irreducible. Okay. So how do you start testing this idea? So the early tests really, so let me just say that the global neuronal workspace theory, one of the key parts of it says that our thinking brain, the thinking part of our brain, the front of our brain, is critical to the workspace. And to me, that makes sense. To me, consciousness is similar to thinking. And the early experiments did support that view because, if you look at that on the left and you see that big cross, that's the visual region of the brain. And when somebody reports that now they're having a conscious perception of something like a gorilla, the information moves forward. When you know, on the right-hand side, now you see all the crosses are at the front. And that's kind of where the workspace is supposed to be. Okay, let me just quickly take you through the different predictions of the two theories that were tested in the adversarial collaboration. So, on the left, we have the predictions of the workspace theory. On the right, the predictions of the integrated information theory. The workspace theory says it involves thinking. The other one says it doesn't involve thinking. It's a state of being, like, you know, the experience a yogi has, not thinking, just experiencing. The workspace theory says it involves the front of the brain. The other theory says it's restricted to the back of the brain, the sensory region. The first one, the workspace says it involves a workspace. The other one says no, it's a special sort of group of neurons at the back of the brain here that are highly integrated called the hot zone. The workspace theory says that, you know, when the workspace is active, there will be an on switch and then there will be an off switch to clear it for the next conscious perception. The other theory says no, you will have continual activity all the time. So this is enough to try to discriminate between these two theories. This is just to show you how complicated these experiments were. They used 3 different types of brain scanners. There was a massive data, which took over 5 years, multiple laboratories doing this research. Now I'm showing you a sports board for a reason. So I started researching this story for my book around about 2022, something like that. And then I realized, oh my goodness, they're going to report the results of this adversarial collaboration at a conference in 2023 in New York. And so I pitched this to Science magazine and said, look, I'll go and I'll cover the great big reveal of this story for you. And they said, okay, go. So I did. And I thought, great, I'm going to get a big scoop for Science magazine covering this amazing story. So I do. And it was held at New York University, which is in Greenwich Village, New York. For those of you who are familiar, it has a very storied history of consciousness raising experiments. And yes, so, you know, it's there was a whole conference, but this particular revelation of the results of this experiment were held on one evening at a hall, and it was an incredible atmosphere, and just buzzing with people and like a real carnival atmosphere. People were really stoked that they were going to get the big reveal of the first adversarial collaboration to get to, you know, the nuts and bolts of what is consciousness really about, and that these 2 big theories were going to get tested. And I've put this up showing, I think it's a soccer game, the way they will typically show the results of a soccer game, because that is the way they presented the results. It was a big preamble. The different sides talked about the research, blah, 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 blah. There was a band. There was lots of entertainment, as I say, a real carnival atmosphere. And then at the end, the big reveal, and this is how it was done, like a sporting event. On one side, one theory, you know, did it score more points than the other theory, like 2 teams, red and blue. And at the end of the evening, the big reveal, actually, The theory that got the most points was integrated information theory, that crazy theory that nobody can understand. And yes, so this is at the end of that reveal. This is Lucia Maloney. She's about to invite the contestants up on the stage, and she's hoping they're going to be nice, that one of the theories seemed to be the winner and the other was the loser. But she knows that they probably won't. And she's quoting Daniel Kahneman, who is actually, the psychologist who came up with the idea of the adversarial collaboration and who mentored her, but warned her, look, even if one team wins and the other team loses, don't expect the loser to be magnanimous. People don't change their minds. As Imre Lakatos told us, people don't change their minds. This is them up on stage. I don't know if you can see, but they're not very happy. Nobody's very happy. This is Stan Deheen, whose theory lost. And next to him is Melanie Bowley, who's standing in for the IIT team. And she's incredibly, got this very disdainful air about her. I'm sorry you can't see it better, but that's what it was like on the stage. People were not happy about the result. Yes, I will need to explain this. But following that, and the real end of the conference or of that particular event was the calling of a bet. And remember I showed you a picture of Christoph Koch early on when he was a lot younger. This is Christoph Koch now. He's very colourful and grey-haired. And they're calling a bet here, a 25-year bet. The guy on the left is David Chalmers. So 25 years before this event, they'd made a bet. David Chalmers is an Australian philosopher now based at New York University. And he's maybe known to some of you, certainly known in the consciousness field for this neologism called the hard problem, which basically says, look, even if you discover the neural correlates of consciousness, see what the signature of consciousness looks like in the brain, it's not going to help you explain consciousness. No more than Leibniz, a philosopher a few hundred years before, who also contemplating consciousness, said, look, even if I could walk in, go into the brain and imagining the brain is like a windmill, and I'd see all the cogs and pulleys inside of the brain, is that going to help me understand, the mind? Is that going to help me understand consciousness? There's just going to be an explanatory gap, no matter what. No matter how you describe the mechanisms, there will still be an explanatory gap till you can explain that ethereal experience of consciousness. So that's what David Chalmers is famous for. But he made a bet with Christoph Koch 25 years ago, and they'd been at this same conference 25 years before, and they'd met in a bar and they'd had a discussion all night, and at the end of the night, they made a bet where Chalmers said, look, not only will you not solve the hard problem, you won't even solve the easy problem. You won't even find the neural correlates of consciousness. And so that was the bet they made 25 years ago. And at the end of this particular evening, Christoph Koch conceded the bet to David Chalmers that even though it seemed that integrated information theory had won more, had gotten a higher score than global neuronal workspace theory, both theories still had their problems, and, you know, we really were still not even at the easy problem of explaining exactly what is happening in the brain when you have a conscious perception. I have to say that all hell broke loose after this conference. I became part of the story. People did not like the way I had reported the story for Science as something like a sporting match where one side won and the other lost, because for obvious reasons, nobody was, well, one side was pretty happy, but the other side wasn't. And oops, oh, something happened to this slide. Anyway, and further to that, a few weeks later, a paper came out signed by over 100 neuroscientists saying that, and by the way, even though integrated information theory won this contest, apparently it's actually a pseudoscience. And if you want to read more about that, go and have a look. But the claim was that its core predictions really are not even testable, and it's a highly oversold theory. So it is a very active debate in the consciousness field. So I will leave it at that.